I think it's unfinished business. If you set yourself a challenge, it's difficult to walk away from it, and you won't find other people there. It's just very hard work traveling there, and the first time I went there, I was there for 2 months. I didn't catch anything at all.
For 9 seasons, river monsters pulled millions into the darkest rivers on Earth. Every episode promised danger, mystery, and survival. Then, at the height of its influence, the show was canceled. No warning, no final showdown. For years, fans accepted it. But behind the cameras, something went wrong. Something Jeremy Wade carried in silence. Now, years later, the truth is finally surfacing. What really forced river monsters to end? And what did Jeremy Wade see that he was never supposed to talk about? Join us as we reveal the truth behind river monsters. It's more shocking than anyone imagined. The ending that never made sense. River monsters didn't fade out, it stopped. And if you were watching back in 2017, you remember how strange it felt. How one day you were waiting for the next season, and the next day it was just over. No warning, no proper goodbye. Just gone, like someone had flipped a switch. At peak popularity too, which made no sense at all, the show was pulling in millions of viewers every single week. People in over 200 countries were hooked. Kids wanted to be Jeremy Wade. Adults stayed up late binge-watching episodes, and suddenly Animal Planet announced it was done, finished, complete. They gave fans a simple explanation. Jeremy Wade had run out of monsters to find. He'd caught everything worth catching. The mission was complete. Time to move on. And honestly, most people accepted it, because what else could they do? The official story sounded reasonable enough. But if you actually think about it for more than 5 seconds, that explanation falls apart completely, because Earth's rivers hold thousands of undiscovered species, remote waterways in the Amazon, the Congo, deep parts of Asia that Wade himself said he'd barely touched, places so dangerous or hidden that no camera crew had filmed there. Running out of monsters wasn't the problem. It was never the problem, and the people close to the show knew it. Producers whispered about it. Crew members hinted at tensions, but nobody came out and said what was really happening behind the scenes, what was making everyone uncomfortable. But before we understand why it ended, we need to understand who Jeremy Wade really was, because the man Animal Planet put on screen wasn't the whole story. The man they couldn't control. Jeremy Wade wasn't a TV host created by Animal Planet. That's the first thing you need to understand, because by the time cameras started following him in 2009, he'd already spent decades hunting river monsters completely alone. No crew, no backup, no safety net. He wasn't reading scripts or following producer notes. He was a real field biologist and an extreme angler who had been doing this work since the 1980s, long before reality television discovered him, long before anyone thought watching a British guy catch fish could become the most watched show on Animal Planet. The cameras didn't make him dangerous. They followed someone who already was, someone who had survived malaria multiple times in the Amazon, someone who had been held at gunpoint by rebels in the Congo, someone who had walked away from plane crashes and been bitten by fish that could tear through flesh like paper. Wade had encountered parasites that burrow into human skin. He'd hunted in war zones. He'd fished in rivers where one wrong move meant death. And he did all of this voluntarily, obsessively, because understanding these creatures mattered more to him than his own safety, more than comfort, more than anything normal people would prioritize. Animal Planet found him because of his book, Somewhere Down the Crazy River, published in 1992, where he wrote about fishing expeditions that read like horror stories, encounters with fish so powerful they could drag grown men underwater, species local people feared more than crocodiles. And as the show grew bigger, Wade started to see something in those rivers that the cameras weren't designed to capture, something that would change everything. Fame exposes a terrifying pattern. As the show grew, Wade noticed something no one else could see, something the producers didn't want to acknowledge, something that kept him awake at night in hotel rooms across the world. And it started happening around season 3 when he returned to rivers he'd fished years before the cameras arrived. The Amazon tributaries he'd explored in the 1990s looked different. The water had changed color.
But the water visibility is poor.
That goes in quite a way.
The fish populations had thinned dramatically, and local guides told him stories about illness and pollution that never made it into the final episodes because networks don't want audiences thinking about environmental collapse. Wade had fished these same spots a decade earlier and remembered exactly what they'd looked like, how many fish he'd caught, how clear the water ran, how vibrant the ecosystems felt. And now he was standing in the same locations watching something die, watching it happen slowly enough that most people wouldn't notice. Rivers he had fished for decades were changing faster than natural cycles could explain. And it wasn't just one location or one species. It was happening everywhere the show filmed, from Southeast Asia to Central Africa to South America, a pattern of decline that nobody wanted to talk about. Fish were disappearing, not just rare species, but common ones too. Fish that should have been easy to find suddenly required weeks of searching, and when Wade finally caught them, they looked smaller, weaker, less healthy than specimens from previous years, like the rivers themselves were sick. What Wade realized next was even worse. He wasn't just documenting nature anymore. He was filming something far more disturbing, something that would haunt him for years. The show was filming extinction. Wade realized each episode wasn't about discovery anymore. It had become something darker, something he never intended to be part of. And the truth hit him hardest during an expedition in Thailand where he spent 3 weeks searching for a giant catfish that locals said had disappeared completely from waters they'd known since childhood.
I'm in Thailand in search of the giant freshwater stingray.
It was a last sighting, a final documentation before these creatures vanished forever, and nobody watching at home understood that the exciting catch they were cheering for might be one of the last members of a dying species, that Wade's success meant he'd found something on the edge of extinction. Amazon rivers poisoned by mercury from illegal gold mining operations. The water looked clear on camera, but contained levels of toxicity that were killing fish slowly, destroying their ability to reproduce. And local indigenous people were getting sick too, but that part never made it into episodes because it was too political. Asian giants wiped out by dams, massive hydroelectric projects that cut off migration routes and destroyed spawning grounds. Fish that had survived for millions of years suddenly trapped in shrinking pools, and Wade knew that filming them now meant filming the end, documenting creatures that wouldn't exist in another generation. African rivers drying into dust because of climate change and upstream water diversion. Places that had flowed for thousands of years reduced to muddy trickles, and the fish that remained were concentrated in smaller spaces, easier to catch, but only because they had nowhere left to go, trapped in their own extinction. But the darkest truth was still coming, and it was something Wade never could have predicted when he agreed to do the show. When success turned dangerous. The darker truth hit Wade like a physical blow. River Monsters wasn't just documenting extinction, it was accelerating it. And he first noticed this pattern in Mongolia after an episode about the giant taimen aired.
As a boy, I read a legend about a taimen trapped in ice.
When local guides contacted him asking if he knew about the fishing tourism companies now advertising trips to catch the exact fish he'd featured. After episodes aired, poachers arrived. People who'd never heard of these remote locations suddenly had exact coordinates, detailed information about what lived there, and motivation to extract whatever value they could before the fish disappeared completely. And Wade's show had given them a perfect roadmap, species identification, location details, everything they needed. Trophy hunters followed too. Wealthy anglers who wanted to catch the same legendary fish Wade had caught, who didn't care about conservation or research, who just wanted the photo and the story. And suddenly, rivers that had been protected by obscurity were exposed to the world, vulnerable in ways they'd never been before. Endangered fish became targets because the show made them famous, made them desirable, turned them into bucket list catches for people with money and no ethics. And Wade watched this happen again and again, seeing the consequences of his success play out in real time as rare species became trophies. The show meant to protect these creatures was helping destroy them, and that irony wasn't lost on Wade, who'd spent his entire adult life trying to understand and preserve these animals, only to realize that television exposure was the worst thing that could have happened to them. The breaking point came when Wade wanted to expose the real monster, and the network showed him exactly where their priorities lay. Monster the show refused to name. Wade wanted to tell the truth, not hints or careful wording or brief mentions that viewers might miss, but an entire episode exposing pollution, climate collapse, and human damage, showing audiences exactly what was happening to these rivers and why it mattered, why they should care about more than just exciting catches.
Stealthy, intelligent, and powerful that they can pluck a shark from the water column and devour it.
Not hints, not whispers buried in narration that most people wouldn't catch, but direct confrontation with the industries and practices destroying these ecosystems, naming companies, showing evidence, making it impossible for viewers to ignore that the real danger wasn't the fish, it was us, our consumption, our waste. An entire episode exposing pollution, showing the mining operations dumping mercury, the factories releasing chemicals, the agricultural runoff choking rivers with nitrogen, the plastic accumulating in waters where fish had lived cleanly for millennia. And Wade had footage, he had interviews, he had scientific data backing every claim. The network said no immediately, didn't even consider it seriously, shut down the idea before Wade could fully pitch it, and the response was clear and unambiguous. This wasn't what River Monsters was supposed to be. This wasn't what sponsors paid for. This wasn't what audiences tuned in to watch. Animal Planet told him directly that this is entertainment, not reality. And those words stuck with Wade, echoed in his mind during every subsequent episode. Because what did it mean that a network called Animal Planet considered actual environmental reality to be unsuitable for broadcast, too uncomfortable for their audience? What happened next in Mongolia would finally break Wade completely, and after that, there was no going back. Mongolia broke Wade. In Mongolia, Wade searched for a legendary fish he once knew well, the giant taimen.
We're in Mongolia fishing for taimen. We've had some luck catching lennik, a species of fish that the taimen feed on.
A species he'd encountered multiple times in the 1990s when he'd traveled through Central Asia alone, before the cameras, before the fame, back when these rivers still held secrets that felt sacred and untouchable. The rivers looked perfect from the surface. Crystal clear water rushing through valleys that seemed untouched by modern civilization. Landscapes so remote and beautiful that the crew kept commenting on how pristine everything appeared, how lucky they were to film in a place that still felt wild and pure. But the fish were gone, completely absent from stretches of river where Wade remembered catching them regularly, where local fishermen had told stories about giants longer than a grown man, where the taimen had lived for generations, surviving harsh winters and fierce currents, adapting and thriving until very recently. Weeks of searching uncovered one weak survivor, a single fish that looked sick, smaller than it should have been for its age, struggling in water that testing revealed was contaminated with runoff from mining operations upstream. Operations that hadn't existed when Wade first visited, operations that were slowly poisoning everything downstream. Wade knew immediately he had just filmed an obituary, not a discovery or an adventure, but a death certificate for a species in this particular river system. And the weight of that realization hit him harder than any previous expedition, because this was a place he'd known before, a place he'd loved. Standing in that Mongolian river, holding a dying species, Wade realized he'd reached a point of no return, that he couldn't keep doing this, couldn't keep pretending everything was fine, couldn't keep being part of a machine that turned environmental collapse into entertainment. That breaking point forced Wade to confront an impossible choice, and what he decided would end everything. The ethical line he would not cross. Standing in dead water, Wade realized the truth with absolute clarity. Every exciting ending was a lie. Every triumphant catch was edited to hide the context.
Close that, and that's a good fish.
Every release shot was framed to avoid showing the polluted banks or the absence of other fish. And he'd been participating in this deception for years. Every smiling release hit a dying river, and Wade had smiled so many times, held up so many fish for the camera, played along with the narrative that everything was fine, that these ecosystems were healthy, that catching and releasing these creatures was somehow helping when the real problems went completely unaddressed. He was helping audiences believe everything was fine, and that was perhaps the worst part, because millions of people watched river monsters and came away thinking these wild places still existed in their full glory, that conservation was working, that the monsters would always be there, waiting in dark water for the next brave angler. So he walked away, made the decision during that Mongolia trip that this would be his last season, that he'd fulfill his contractual obligations and then stop, no matter how much money they offered, no matter how much fans wanted more, because continuing meant compromising everything he believed in. The decision wasn't easy. River monsters had given him a platform, financial security, global recognition, the ability to travel and research in ways he never could have afforded alone. But all of that meant nothing if the show was actively harming the creatures and ecosystems he cared about most deeply. Wade realized he had no power to change the show's direction. He was just the face, just the talent. And Animal Planet owned everything else, owned the story, owned the ending, owned the legacy. So they created a fiction to explain his departure, and Wade played along one final time. The lie sold to the public. Animal Planet announced a perfect ending, a carefully crafted press release explaining that Jeremy Wade had accomplished his mission, caught every legendary fish he'd set out to find, explored every remote river worth exploring, and now it was time to close this chapter and move on to new adventures, whatever those might be. Wade played along, bound by contracts that prevented him from contradicting the official narrative, forced to smile in interviews and talk about how fulfilling the journey had been, how grateful he was for the opportunity.
A fine leader of very thin line, it's the weight of the fly line propels the fine leader.
How proud he felt of what River Monsters had accomplished, even though every word felt like ash. Fans mourned the show, organized online campaigns asking Animal Planet to reconsider, created petitions demanding more seasons, wrote heartfelt messages about what River Monsters had meant to them, how it had inspired them to care about nature, how Wade's passion had changed their perspective, and none of them knew the real reason it died. The truth stayed buried for years, locked behind non-disclosure agreements and professional courtesy, hidden beneath Wade's natural tendency toward privacy, his British reluctance to air grievances publicly, his desire to move on rather than burn bridges, even bridges that probably deserved burning for what they'd done to his life's work. Wade moved on to other projects, smaller shows that gave him more creative control, documentary work that allowed him to tell harder truths, writing projects where he could be honest about what he'd witnessed, but nothing ever reached the audience that River Monsters had. Nothing carried the same weight or influence. The official story remained unchallenged for nearly a decade, fans accepting the explanation they'd been given and media outlets repeating the network's talking points. Wade stayed silent, keeping the secret, protecting people who probably didn't deserve protection. But now, he's finally ready to say what really happened. The final confession. Now 69 years old, Jeremy Wade finally says it plainly, without the careful wording or diplomatic language he's used for years, without worrying about relationships or reputation or what the industry thinks of him. Because at this point in his life, the truth matters more than anything else, more than comfort or approval. The real monster was never a fish. That's what Wade wants everyone to understand. The creatures he spent decades hunting were never the problem. They were victims, symptoms of a much larger crisis, and focusing on them as monsters was always a distraction from the actual threat, the actual danger lurking beneath the surface. It was us, humanity, our pollution choking rivers with chemicals and plastic, our dams fragmenting ecosystems that had existed for millions of years, our climate change warming waters beyond what these ancient species could tolerate, our greed extracting resources without considering consequences, our willful ignorance about what we're destroying, and Wade can't stay silent about that anymore. Our pollution has turned pristine rivers into toxic waste channels, mercury from mining operations, agricultural runoff loaded with pesticides, industrial discharge containing chemicals that don't break down. Our denial keeps us comfortable, keeps us consuming, keeps us pretending that someone else will solve these problems, that technology will save us, that the damage isn't really that bad, that we have more time, that individual choices don't matter, that corporations and governments will do the right thing without pressure, and that denial is killing the planet. River Monsters ended because he refused to lie anymore, refused to pretend that catching and releasing endangered fish was conservation, refused to help audiences feel good about a world that was actually dying, refused to be entertainment when what people needed was education, warning, a wake-up call that might actually change behavior before it's too late. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.